What is up, guys? So today I'm going to be talking about something that is probably the single most important product in my life right now. And that is the camera that has been my workhorse for the past year, the Sony a7 Mark III. Now, when this camera first came out, I think it's pretty safe to say that it was pretty revolutionary. And prior to this, no one had ever seen a full frame camera for under $2,000 offer the same amount of features that this one does. I'm talking about 120 frames per second in 1080, 4K, 10 frames per second in photo mode, dual card slots, IAF, and much more. But now it's 2020 and a lot of other camera manufacturers have started to come out with some pretty compelling options of their own. And you're probably wondering how the Sony a7 III stands in comparison to all the new competition. While I can't really speak too much on that because I haven't actually tried most of the other cameras, I can tell you about my experience owning and using this camera for the past year. What I like, what I don't like, and possibly some deal breakers. Now, before we really get into this, I just want to say that I absolutely love this camera. Like, overall, my experience with this camera has been really great, and it has become an essential part of my kit. But there are some things that I don't like about it and make it really annoying to use it for my workflow. I guess I would describe myself as a semi-professional photographer, and I mainly do portraits for graduation pictures and stuff like that. I also just go out and take pictures for fun of all kinds of stuff like landscapes and architecture. And more recently, I started this YouTube channel and I've been using this as my camera for literally everything on this channel. So if you want some more samples of what this camera can produce, just look at my other videos and you'll get a good idea. I also won't be going over a lot of the technical specifications of this camera, like showing graphs of ISO performance. If you want to see that, there are already plenty of videos out there capturing all of that information in great detail. And I don't think I could do as good of a job as they are, so I'm just not going to try. What I'm going to be focusing more on is what it's like to actually own and use this camera, all the features and settings that I actually used, and hopefully you'll get a better idea of whether or not it's worth it for you to pick up this camera in 2020. So let's start off by talking about the design and ergonomics of the body itself. Now, I know the aesthetics of the camera don't actually matter, but honestly, I am such a big fan of the design that I'm going to talk a little bit about it anyways. Like, I think that Sony did a really great job of mixing modern and vintage. The really angular design of the EVF housing really reminds me of old school Fuji cameras, but the rest of the body has a lot of subtle curves that just look great in my opinion and give it kind of a modern edge. Now, on to something more tangible, literally. I think that the ergonomics are quite good as well. A lot of people say that the grip is too small and their pinky just kind of doesn't have a place to rest. But honestly, I never found that I had a problem with that. I guess I just have small hands or something, but the camera just fits perfectly in my hands. The grip ends right at the end of my pinky, and the depth of the grip also feels really nice in my hands. The only thing about the grip that I have a small complaint about is the material covering it. I think it's like a rubber or something that they wanted to make look like leather, but it just feels kind of cheap and it's not very grippy at all. Like, I've felt the grip materials on some of the Canon cameras like the EOS-R, and they just feel way nicer. They're super grippy. Like, if you put a finger on there and actually try to slide it around, you'll definitely get some resistance. But on the Sony grip material, you just get no resistance and it feels super smooth, which is not what you want on a grip. A grip should be grippy, and that is a fact. Button and dial placement is really good though. Something I really like about the Sonys is that pretty much everything is accessible with only your right hand, which comes in really handy if you're traveling or something and your other hand is occupied by something, like, you know, you have a coffee or something like that in your hands. Or if you're shooting solo and you need to prop up something in front of the lens. That being said, most other cameras on the market operate that anyways. I was just kind of thinking about how on the EOS-R, the on and off switch is on the left side of the camera. And I'm just really glad that the a7 III is not that way. I'm also glad that the a7 III has 3 separate dials that you can set to change shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Having those 3 things on 3 separate physical dials just makes operation so much smoother and making quick adjustments really easy. It's especially handy when you're shooting on a partially cloudy day and the clouds keep on moving and changing the light. You end up having to change the settings all the time, and having 3 separate physical dials helps a ton in making quick adjustments. I know on a lot of Canons, to change ISO, you need to first press a button and then turn a dial. It's not really a big deal, it's just an extra step. And by the way, I don't really mean to keep up bringing up Canon, it's just that it's really the only other system that I have any experience with. So it's just kind of my only example to have a comparison to. I do have some complaints about the body though, but most are pretty minor. First, I know I said I really like the dials, but I do wish that they were made out of metal and not plastic. I think that these are probably the three things that I touch the most on the camera body apart from the shutter button, which thankfully is made out of metal. I know it really doesn't affect the performance or usability of the camera, but I think it would go a long way in making this feel a little bit more premium. The only other thing about the design that I really have a complaint about is the screen. It flips, but it only flips in one way. And this is an issue for a couple of reasons. First is you can't flip the screen around and be able to check your framing while you're filming yourself. And it's just really annoying for people like me who are one-man crews starting a YouTube channel and don't have the money for external monitors and stuff like that. There is an app that you can download onto your phone and kind of use it as an external monitor over Wi-Fi, but to be totally honest, the app just isn't that great. It just takes a long time to connect and it has really big latency issues. You also can't set focus, and on top of that, the image that displays on your phone is just extremely low resolution. So I can never tell if anything is in focus from it. So I'll always have to check on the camera to see if the focus was grabbed correctly anyways, which by the way will sever the connection between your phone and the camera. So if you didn't get it right the first time, you'll have to go through the whole connection process again, and it's just a real pain in the butt. And all of that is just to say that I think that the app really needs some work. In theory, I think it's a great idea, but they got a long way to go before it's really a good experience that I would recommend people use. The second reason I would really like a flippy screen, and probably the bigger issue for me, is that it just severely limits your options when you want to get some creative angles, especially for photos. For example, I shoot most of my photos for Instagram, and if you guys don't already know, to have your image appear the largest on someone's screen in Instagram, you need to shoot vertically at a 4:5 aspect ratio. And because of that, I shoot almost everything in portrait orientation. And with a screen that only flips one way like the A7 III, anytime I try to shoot super high or super low, I'm shooting totally blind. And you can say that no one ever really needs to shoot from those angles anyways, and you're totally entitled to your opinion, but I'm just saying that this is something that I run into all the time and it frustrates the heck out of me. The only really valid argument that I've heard for keeping the screen set up the way it is that a fully articulating screen, if you shoot landscape mode, high or low, the screen is kind of offset from the center of the body and it's just kind of disorienting to use. And I agree that that is a sacrifice that you would need to make to incorporate a fully articulating screen. But I would also say that it's a very small sacrifice for incorporating a feature that would just open so many doors for so many creators. Also, the offset might even be an asset in certain situations. For example, if I have the camera mounted onto a gimbal, the screen is often blocked by the motor, a problem that wouldn't happen if the screen was off to the side. Anyways, I'm sorry that was a really long rant about the screen, but it's just something that I'm very passionate about. I do have one more thing to complain about with the screen though, and that is just that the quality of the panel just isn't that great. It's just really small and not very sharp. So sometimes it's really hard to tell if stuff is focused correctly, so I always have to spend extra time on location zooming into photos that could otherwise be spent on anything else. And it also just doesn't get very bright. You can adjust the brightness manually in the settings, but I just leave it on max all the time because it just really doesn't get that bright. I don't know how many nits it is, but just don't plan on using it in brighter situations. When it's sunny outside, I always just have to use the EVF to review my photos. It's also so bad that I generally just don't like to show clients their pictures while we're on location, because they'll get the wrong idea and think that the picture is actually a lot worse than it actually is. And while the panel is a touchscreen, you can't use it to go through the menu, which just seems like a really obvious oversight to me, especially since the menu system is every bit as bad and confusing as everyone says it is. Okay, so moving on to the EVF, it's pretty good. It's sharp enough, I just wish it was a little bit bigger. But other than that, I really don't have anything else to say about it other than that it works and it works well. Another thing that works really well is the autofocus, both in photo and video, but mostly photo. So I'll talk about photo autofocus first. And if you pair this up with a good lens, the autofocus in photo mode is absolutely incredible. It's lightning fast, and if you put it in tracking, it'll just really grab hold of the subject and just hold on super tight. IAF, which is what I think really put Sony on the map in the first place, is amazing. It works like 95% of the time, and I'd say that the 5% of the time that it doesn't work so well is usually when the subject is wearing a hat and their eyes are kind of in the shadow, when part of the face is turned away, or sometimes when the subject is wearing glasses. Although I will say with the glasses, it works fine most of the time. I just noticed that while rare, it sometimes misses and focuses on the glasses instead of the eyes. Overall though, I'd give the photo mode autofocus a solid A+. And it's just so reliable that I hardly ever need to think about it. I just leave it in wide mode and I can almost always trust that it'll just nail the focus. In video though, I'd say that the autofocus is good but not great. Like for this channel, I do a lot of product shots and I just feel like the camera has a really hard time figuring out what to focus on. Like in photo mode, I almost feel like the camera can kind of read my mind and just focus what it needs to. But in video mode, I always feel like I'm kind of fighting against it almost. I also feel like I'm just not really satisfied with the tracking. If there's a shot where I have to pull in or pull out, I always have to make sure I'm going very, very slow, or else it'll just totally lose the subject and I'll have to do it over again. There's also face detect autofocus in video, which I'm very thankful that it has, and it works very well. But I do have to complain about it just a little bit, because it'll just turn itself off sometimes when you turn on other settings or use other features. For example, when you connect the camera to the app on your phone, Face Detect AF no longer works, and you have to manually turn it back on once you sever the connection. And sometimes the display will say that Face AF is on and working, but as soon as you hit record, it'll turn itself off. And it's just hugely frustrating because I've had to redo entire videos because Face Detect AF had turned itself off without warning. And the camera focused on my mic instead of my face. So it's just something that you have to be very aware of and check constantly. And it's really annoying. So one thing that I have pretty much no complaints about with in this camera is the image quality. So this camera has a full frame 24.2 megapixel sensor and it is very, very impressive. So 24 megapixels in my opinion is pretty much the perfect sweet spot in terms of having enough resolution to crop in a bit if you need to, and having manageable file sizes. If you feel like you need more resolution than that for large prints or anything like that, you probably already know it and Sony has a different camera for you. But I think that for 90% of people out there, you really don't need more than 24. More importantly, I think, is the dynamic range and low light performance, which I am glad to report are phenomenal. Like, I really think it's impossible to oversell how great the files that come out of this camera are. I mean, of course, you can never have too much dynamic range. I mean, I'm sure in the future they'll have cameras that can take pictures of the sun and a black hole in the same image and not have any clipping. But the amount of freedom that this gives you is really impressive. So Sony says that this gives you 15 stops of dynamic range, which is cool and all, but that's just a number. And what that translates to in real world use is that it opens a lot of doors as far as what conditions you can shoot in. Like a lot of the time, I just don't have too much control over what time or what location I go shoot at. But the great thing about this camera is that the dynamic range is just so good that I feel like no matter what the conditions are, I can trust that I'll be able to bring up the shadows or bring down the highlights when I need to. And that just brings me a lot of peace of mind. And I think that's also just a good way to describe my experience with this camera as a whole. Peace of mind. Like, for the most part, I never really felt like I was really fighting with the camera, and while I was shooting with it, I wouldn't have to think about the camera, and I could think more about the creative side, like composition and color and stuff like that. And I think it's really important to mention that, because I think when we start talking about features like FPS, like resolution, it's really easy to get lost in the numbers, but the camera is a tool, which is to say that it's a means to an end, and saying that I don't have to think about the camera while I'm using it is probably the highest praise that I can give it. Now, you may be thinking, Jesse, you just spent half of this freaking video complaining about the screen. And yes, you'd be right, but it's just because this camera does so many things right that if I talked about all of them, this video would be like an hour long and nobody wants that. The only thing about this camera that I really hate is just how the screen doesn't flip out. I think it would add so much functionality to this camera if they added one, and it's the only reason that I would upgrade from this camera to a different one. Like for the a7 IV, if Sony kept everything the same, but just added a flippy screen, I would probably go out and buy that. That's how much I want the flippy screen, and that's also how much I am satisfied with the rest of the camera. Anyways, that's all for this video. I know it was a long one, and a special thanks to anybody who made it to the end. Remember to smash that like button, and if you enjoy content like this, think about subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss anything. As always, if you still have any questions about this camera or just have something to say to me, just leave it in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. See you guys in the next one. Peace!